Very good to be with you. I think what we'll try and do is to look at some pictures together for about 40 minutes and then have 20 minutes exchange and conversation. Does that seem to be the right balance of things? Good. I've entitled this Picturing Jesus because clearly how we see Christ in a way is how we construct our picture of what Christianity might be. Who was Jesus of Nazareth? And it is that which is both a puzzle, but also the clue. Because if we go to the next slide, which is the real slide, there we see, in fact, not one image of Jesus, but in fact, a whole range of images, a whole gallery, if you like, perhaps indicating, if I can anticipate my conclusion, that no single image can actually capture the reality of that central figure in Christianity who is claimed to be a person, just like you and me, and yet also to be divine. But let's have a look and see how artists at various times and in quite different cultural contexts have actually constructed their picture of Jesus Christ. So we'll move on to the next slide. This is a painting by the rather curious artist Stanley Spencer, the English artist Stanley Spencer. He entitled it Christ Entering Jerusalem. It was painted in 1921 and now hangs in Leeds City Art Gallery. Here he places Jesus on a donkey. The figures are all a little confused and confusing. But believe you me, when you look at the painting itself, you can see that there is a donkey, there is a figure. It's a highly populated pictorial scene with people moving backwards and forwards and through a pathway, through rows of cabbages. Who would grow cabbages in their front garden? But anyway, they seem to be cabbages growing there. People walking up and down that street, people preoccupied with their own business, people engaged with other people. It's a very busy scene, and yet in the middle of it is this figure. I once showed this slide to a group of theological students, and as the slide was being shown, one student put his hand up and said, "Could you please indicate which one is supposed to be Jesus?" It was a very good question, and even Stanley Spencer himself realised that it was just such a busy painting and that he really hadn't rendered the donkey as being immediately recognisable as a donkey. Nevertheless, I think what we have here is an important pictorial statement of the challenge of having to picture Christ, of how Christ might be imagined and shown. Because what the artist Stanley Spencer has done is to locate this biblical scene, this scene from the story of Jesus, in his own home village of Cookham in Berkshire. So in fact, this canvas is peopled with folk who he saw every day. These are the people he saw when he went shopping. These are the people he saw as he walked down the street. And there they are, a rather motley group. Some standing idly by the fence. Others seem to be totally oblivious to this figure moving down the centre of the road, riding on a donkey. So no wonder the question, which one is Jesus? But perhaps what this particular painting tells us is that this incarnate Christ, this Christ made flesh, the person of Jesus, walks, in fact, incognito. Let's move to another picture, a very different composition. This is a painting by the rather restless artist Paul Gauguin, painted in 1889, just 1 year after his rather dramatic breakup with Vincent van Gogh in Arles. This painting, called The Yellow Christ, locates Jesus in a particular landscape, in a particular cultural context. There is something almost anachronistic, because the figure, life-size, is in fact the figure of Christ, and yet we know that Christ wasn't actually crucified in the French countryside. Nevertheless, here are these Breton women engaged in some kind of devotional activity around the cross, as indeed Breton women of that time would pause and pray in the wayside Calvaries, which marked out the roads of Breton. Wonderful rolling hills. You can see one figure in the mid-point here just clambering over a wall. Again, indicative of the fact that although, here is Jesus crucified in their midst, others can go about, as it were, oblivious of his, unrecognising his presence. And we move on to another painting, this time by Albert Edelfelt, and it's a painting of another gospel scene, a scene described by St. John in the 4th Gospel, when the risen Christ allows himself to be seen by Mary Magdalene in the garden on the first Easter morning. What Albert Edelfelt has done, this Finnish artist, is to locate that meeting, that encounter, in his own landscape. This is recognisably Finland. There is the lake. There is always a lake wherever you go in Finland. And there are always those wonderful trees, those silver birches. But there is a Christ figure and Mary Magdalene, painted in 1890 and now to be seen in Helsinki Art Gallery. There are the outcrops of rock. There is that physical landscape of Finland. And so he transposes that gospel encounter into his own natural and cultural context. Jesus appearing in the style of a rather pious Bible illustration of the time, and yet Mary Magdalene there dressed in contemporary dress. So an extraordinary 19th century painting. Well, now we come to something quite different. It's a painting, and you can tell from that slide that I've taken that from the internet. But I wanted to show this slide of the Graham Sutherland painting in the Mary Magdalene Chapel of the cathedral that's probably closer to you than we are in Canterbury. That's Chichester Cathedral. An extraordinary modern painting by Graham Sutherland, commissioned by Walter Hussey in 1961 for the particular chapel of Mary Magdalene. And let's take a closer look at the painting. Having seen its context, there we can see a painting that is really quite extraordinary. It's almost abstract. It's most certainly highly symbolic. Christ tells Mary Magdalene, remember, that she can no longer hold him, contain him, that the risen Christ transcends time and space, can no longer be held. Touch me not, a subject that has been worked by so many artists down the centuries, and here is a modern artist presenting the same, but in an extraordinarily symbolic way. Christ literally walking up the staircase, there indicating his ascent. I have not yet ascended to my Father and your Father. So that movement of the risen Christ to the heavenly places and to the Father himself. And I suppose it could be that this shape here, rather like an eye, represents the all-seeing eye, represents God, as it were, God the Father, the destination, the summit of Christ's ascent. And through the opening, a verdant background, the garden scene is still there, but notice the rather spiky plants that are there. Perhaps, again, a reference to the crown of thorns placed on the head of the one who had been crucified. But the most extraordinary thing about this particular composition is the emotional tension between the figures. Notice how both Mary Magdalene and Christ himself reach out with their arms. Their hands are extended, and yet they do not touch. Touch me not. And yet there is, as it were, that magnetism, that electrical charge between them, that emotional charge between them. Mary Magdalene looks up to that overwhelming presence of God in Christ, reaching out as one would reach out towards a lover. And yet, that one, he is now part stranger. What an extraordinary composition that is. If we can move on, thank you. Here's something of a very, very different style. It's an etching by Rembrandt, the mid-17th century Dutch artist, and it's an etching entitled Christ Teaching. Again, it's a very full picture. It shows Christ here teaching. Some seem to be utterly engrossed in whatever it is he is saying. Others seem to be distracted. There's even a child playing, looking away, and totally absorbed in a child's game. Some look just a little bored. So it's a very mixed gathering of people. And in one sense, Christ is just one among many in that crowd, in that scene. He's certainly recognizable as the one who is teaching, the one who's there being emphatic and gesturing and so on. making his points. But it is a human being among other human beings. Almost possibly a human being now drained of divinity. But that's really just to be a little provocative. I think already we're beginning to see how we need a variety, in fact, a whole gallery of pictures to begin to capture something of the impact of this particular figure, Jesus Christ. Not only historically, but also across cultures. One commentator has written, "In our common experience of human beings, we do in fact apprehend different faces in one and the same person. And as it is for us, perhaps even more so if Christ is, as he is claimed to be. We need multiple images. We need a full gallery. But staying with Rembrandt for a moment, remember that series of self-portraits. The face becomes so central for an artist like Rembrandt. And Rembrandt believed that it was actually the face that gave the viewer a window into the soul of the person. If you want to really see a person, just catch their eye. And that, of course, was the challenge of the portrait painter like Rembrandt. So we're going to look at some faces. The former Archbishop of Canterbury, and certainly to my mind one of the greatest living theologians, Rowan Williams, once said that being lovingly faced by another person is what gives us a sense of being a self, of being an individual who has value, who matters, of being an individual soul. Here's an image of Jesus Christ as a background. An image painted by Sarah Jenkins, awaiting a third Messiah, it's entitled. Perhaps hinting in its choice of subject that the Messiah, the Christ, needs to be someone who in some way is in total solidarity with every race and people and ethnic identity. But let's move on to a wonderful portrait. In fact, this is Rembrandt's face of Jesus. Now, interestingly, and I think interestingly for the particular course that you've been following in these weeks, Rembrandt wanted to paint an authentic Jesus. He wanted a real Christ. And so he actually hired as his model for this face of Jesus a Jew. A Jew in Amsterdam, a Jew who in some sense would have been considered something of an outsider. And yet it was precisely this person who was chosen as the model for the face of Christ. Rembrandt indeed painted a series of faces of Jesus fairly soon after the death of his wife, at that time when he sought comfort and solace in his own art and indeed in his faith. Just keep the lineaments, as it were, the contours of that particular face, and we'll move on to another image. This, in fact, is the face of Jesus by John Piper. Most of us are very familiar with his work in stained glass, but he was also a very able draftsman. And here, having, I think, been on a tour looking at Romanesque art in cathedrals, both in England and in France, he came back and reproduced in the style of Romanesque art this face of Christ. It's in fact a watercolour and gouache on paper, and it's at Pannant House, again in Chichester. But we move on, or rather move back, to another important face of Jesus, the face of the Christ figure painted on the cross of San Damiano. This cross of San Damiano is believed to be the cross that hung in the dilapidated chapel where Francis of Assisi went to pray at that moment of utter crisis in his life. And one of his biographers tells how, as he looked at this painted cross suspended directly above the altar in this tumble-down chapel, Francis had a very keen sense that Christ addressed him directly, spoke to him, and said, "Rebuild my church," which he took both literally and metaphorically. It is an extraordinary compilation of the showing of Christ. Yes, it is Christ crucified, deliberately showing a great deal of the flesh, perhaps emphasizing that here indeed was God enfleshed. But the extraordinary thing is the body itself is perfectly at ease. It is as though the figure is simply standing against the cross, although you can see the nails in both hands and in this painted cross in both feet. It tells the story then, not only of the death of Christ on the cross, but also of his resurrection, and indeed of the ascension. There you have, in a rondel at the top, the figure of Christ ascending and being greeted by the company of heaven, all those angels welcoming him to his heavenly home. So here is a picture of Jesus that somehow holds together both his suffering, his death, and also his resurrection and ascension. The whole Christian story, as it were, is there fused in this single complex image. But notice the face, and we've got a close-up of it, so thank you. Those extraordinary open almond-shaped eyes. Remember what we were hinting at when we were talking about the importance of the face. here is a figure who not only invites our attention, but who is also looking at us in the way that Francis believed that Christ engaged him and addressed him directly. There is, of course, something Byzantine, something Greek. It may well remind you of some of the Eastern Church icons you may have seen, either of Christ or of the saints. And it's understood that at the time when these wooden crosses were being made in Umbria, in Italy, there were Byzantine icon writers living there, and also perhaps some from Syria, which of course was a very different place than it is so tragically today. But let's move on. Hold that picture. Here, to my mind, is an utterly electric image of the face of Christ. It's by the artist known as El Greco, entitled Saviour of the World, and painted around 1600, a painting that now hangs in the Scottish National Museum of Art in Edinburgh. It is as though the Byzantine icon tradition, brought into Western art by El Greco, the Greek, that was his nickname, of course born in Crete, and eventually settling in the Spanish city of Toledo. That radiant mystical aura is, of course, reminiscent of earlier icons of Christ that date back to the 6th century. There is one wonderful example from the monastery of St. Catherine's in Sinai, and the Christ figure looks like that. Here is, as it were, a window onto the divine. The sheer luminosity of this particular painting also speaks volumes. You know, it literally shines out. It radiates, and it radiates light and warmth. And yet, it isn't totally a mystical painting. And by that I mean one that is totally disconnected to the earthly or cultural references which are at play when we begin to picture Jesus. Because, curiously, the model for this painting was, again, a Jew in Toledo. A Jew, in fact, was found drowned in the river. And El Greco said, here is my model for the face of Christ, the Saviour of the world. We have the next one, please. The much neglected, I think, modern French artist, Georges Rouault, The Head of Christ, a painting painted in 1937, rather abstract yet full of colour. This particular artist, Rouault, of course, also trained as a stained glass maker of stained glass. And you can tell by the colouring and the mixing of colours, the placing of the colours in this composition. Again, it's almost, isn't it, like a stained glass window. Those very rich, jewel-like colours. It does look as though the sun is streaming through that particular composition, the head of Christ. Rouault himself, a devout Catholic who attended Mass each day. He had been a gifted pupil and first apprentice to a firm of stained glass artists. Like so many, and indeed Stanley Spencer could be counted as a World War I artist, Georges Rouault, of course French, but seeing the loss and devastation of the First World War affected his choice of subjects. And he tended to paint outsiders, prostitutes, clowns, Christ. And in this richly coloured painting, again, we see an image of one who allows the glory through. In this range of the paintings of Christ, I think what I'm trying to show is that there is both a wanting to show the authentic Jesus of Nazareth, the historic person, hence artists choosing Jewish models, and yet also in their painterly way indicating that this human form also radiated something of the divine, and this is most clearly seen in what I have described as the iconic style of showing the face of Christ. But let's move on. In different epochs and again in different contexts, Christ has been figured in a variety of ways. Picturing Jesus, we would assume that the cross would have been a very early way of depicting Jesus, but that actually wasn't the case. First, the way in which Jesus came to be depicted in art was in the figure of the shepherd. And here is a mid-3rd century catacomb decoration in San Donatilla, a catacomb in Rome. You have to remember the context, of course, that this was a rather rough decoration, stenciling almost, in a catacomb in a place where the Christian community would bring its dead. This was, as it were, the cemetery. And so here is Christ depicted as the Good Shepherd, leading the flock around him and carrying the lamb on his shoulders. Here, indeed, is the newly departed being brought into where? Well, you can see the rich, verdant background setting. Here, if you like, here is paradise. Here are the Elysian fields. Here is that beautiful place where Christ takes his own. But one way of picturing Jesus is not only to show what he did, but to show all that happened to him, what I'm going to describe as his fate. So we're going to move quickly on. And here indeed is one of the earliest depictions of Jesus on the cross. It's 8th century. A fresco, quite a small fresco, in a church in Rome, Santa Maria Antiqua. There's something realistic and yet also absolutely symbolic about this particular depiction of the crucifixion. Notice again those outstretched arms and the open eyes. We are, of course, in this 8th century image, some distance away from the later Gothic, tortured, agonized figure of the crucified. But something extraordinary is being shown here. What is this outstretched arm? Well, it reflects some of the prayers which were used. From age to age, you gather a people to yourself, so that from east to west a perfect offering may be made to the glory of your name. You stretched out your arms on the cross as an act of accepting sacrifice, of suffering, but also perhaps as a gesture of welcome, a gesture of a forgiving embrace and a gathering of people. But the cross became, at certain points in Christian history, a very definite emblem, as it were, of human suffering. Here is a small panel painted for private meditation by the enigmatic German artist Matthias Grunwald. It is the scene of the crucifixion, and here undoubtedly is presented to the viewer the image of the dead Christ, decaying flesh, pockmarked. You can see it even at this distance. Decaying flesh, rather like the torn and ragged loincloth around Christ's loins. Here is a depiction of Christ that certainly doesn't recoil from the horror of his suffering. In this portrayal of putrefying flesh. But moving quickly on to something in the 20th century. Can we just switch back to that first Grunwald? Can you look at the hands on the cross, almost like claws? And now we go forward to a 20th century painting by Graham Sutherland, and you can see those hands reappear. This is quite a small canvas that was painting by Graham Sutherland, commissioned by Walter Hussey again, that extraordinary patron of modern art in churches. Again, picturing a Jesus who doesn't recoil from the horror of agony and death. But it is painted against an abstract background. Notice the stones there, perhaps showing this crucifixion in an urban, so-called civilized world. There is something in this portrayal that shows us the crucifixion, the event that happened once and for all. But it's also here, it's also now. When Walter Hussey was commissioning this painting for the Church of St. Matthew's in Northampton, he invited the artist, the German artist Hans Feibusch, to come and talk to the church council. And Feibusch said this in 1946. The men who have come home from the war, and the rest of us, have seen too much horror and evil. Only the most profound, tragic, moving, sublime vision can redeem us. that's certainly a sublime and tragic painting. Moving on. Something completely different, again by Stanley Spencer. The Scorpion in the Wilderness, painted in 1936. Stanley Spencer aimed to produce a painting on this general theme of the wilderness as a Lenten exercise. And what he would have liked to have done is, there are 40 days in Lent, he would have liked to have painted 40 canvases. He didn't actually get anywhere near that. But here is one, and it's called The Scorpion. And there is the figure of Christ, and it's the gospel story of the temptation. There is Jesus driven out to the desert place. And curiously, in the palm of his hand, he is holding the scorpion. The scorpion that bites, the scorpion with its poison, that harmful and scary insect. Stanley Spencer saw this as a sign of the integrity between what he described as mankind and the world of nature. But it reminds me of a play by Dennis Potter. It was actually a television play shown in, I think, 1969, called The Son of Man. The play opens, and there is Jesus in the desert. Unlike this rather contemplative image, Jesus is crouching down on the ground, thumping his clenched fist into the sand and saying, "Who am I? Who am I?" Well, that's not a bad question to draw us towards a conclusion for this evening. But there's just a couple more very quick pictures to go. We might see in this Piero della Francesca an image that tells us who Jesus is. It's a kind of epiphany, a showing, a manifestation of this figure as this figure is understood in Christian self-understanding and definition. Again, rather like those early modern paintings, the Paul Gauguin, Stanley Spencer, Christ entering Jerusalem in Cookham. You see in the background three people, very well dressed people, just walking off into the distance. Again, failing to recognise or to take cognizance of something that's happening. And something is happening. It's extraordinary. This painting is in the National Gallery in London. And if you haven't seen it, please do go and see it. Again, it's absolutely wonderful in a room by itself. And you can see it's as though something a moment has been frozen in time. You can see in the painting itself the very drops of water falling from the vessel held by John the Baptist as he is baptizing Christ. Look at that extraordinary composition. The verticality, the parallel between the tree trunk and the figure of Christ standing on the edge of the water. And the three attendant angels, and particularly the expression on the face of the angel in the middle. Sheer horror, apprehending what is going to happen. What is going to happen to this figure? He, of course, is going to be nailed to the tree. But let's move on to this. In Tuscany, in the Borgo San Sepolcro, which is the hometown of Piero della Francesca. There is, in fact, a painting of the resurrection. There it is. That's what you see when you walk into that space. But let's quickly look at that painting. Here is the crucified Christ. You can still see the red marks of blood on the hands and the pierced side. And yet, a virile pose. There he is, his right foot firmly on the edge of the sarcophagus. The body, as it were, sprung, ready to move. Something has happened. He bears the standard of the cross. The guards are asleep. Something is happening. And what is happening is indeed the change and the shift from old to new creation, symbolised most clearly in the trees, the bare tree on the left and the verdant full-leaf tree on the right. Now, I think we're going to just quickly move on. Thank you very much. A similar painting, contemporary artist Roger Wagner, who is in Oxford. And there, Calvary, the three crosses, superimposed on the trees. An extraordinary kind of mystical burst and flight of birds in the sky, and the sheep gathering to contemplate that. It's called Crucifixion on Dartmoor. And then finally, painted by Van Gogh, a series of The Sower. And perhaps here we see again what it is to picture Jesus Christ, if Christ is who is understood to be in the Christian tradition. That huge sunburst, that full sun above the sower's head, the tree leaning into the picture, there, as it were, showing that that figure is going to be the one who will hang on the wood of the cross, and yet whose feet are most firmly there in the rich soil of the ploughed field as he sows his seed. The figure, as it were, bringing together the divine light and life and the earthiness of life in the world. Christ as mediator. I've finished. Thank you.